Welcome everybody to the panel on Geoactivism here at the Cascadia Poetry Festival. For the next 70 minutes we'll be discussing the confluence of geography and activism and what role poetry may find for itself in that fusion. I'm Kim Goldberg, and as Paul just said, I live in Nanaimo. Our three panelists, each of whom I will be introducing in more detail in just a moment, are Eric DePlace from Seattle, Kaia Sand from Portland, and Trevor Carolan from North Vancouver. So just to get things rolling on our discussion here, I wanted to give a couple of fairly high-profile examples of recent poetic geoactivism from British Columbia. First, the Hanshan Project. This was an undertaking by BC poet Susan McCaslin. She wanted to do something to protect the McClellan Forest, which is east of Vancouver, and it was at imminent risk of being sold for development and logged. And it was a very rich and diverse ecosystem. It turned out to have some rare and threatened species in it, a cottonwood tree that was hundreds of years old, quite a few very important ecological features, apart from the fact that it was also public forest land, and so it's a shame, obviously, to lose that to deforestation. So Susan, quite a renowned poet in her own right, was very inspired by the ancient Chinese poet Han Shan, who posted his poems on the trees and rocks of Cold Mountain. So Susan put out a call to poets everywhere, as it turned out. I don't think she realized what she was really opening the floodgates for. She put out a call to poets asking them to send her ecological poems so that she could then hang them in this forest, as Han Shan had hung his own poems in the forest. And she was absolutely flooded with poetry from all around the world. She received hundreds of poems, nearly 1,000, from award-winning poets, from 6-year-old children, and from everybody in between. So it just shows the level of public interest and from all around the planet. Over the ensuing week, she hung each of these poems in a little plastic sleeve. She hung it in the forest, tied to the trees, not using any nails or tacks that would damage the living forest. So she effectively turned the forest into a gigantic, living, breathing poetry anthology. Now this vision, it was just so inspirational and so unique, really, that it drew quite a bit of media attention from all over Canada, including Canada's national paper of record, the Globe and Mail, and ultimately, as a result of all of this public attention and exposure, the forest was saved. So that worked. Another example of poetry geoactivism from British Columbia is Christine Leclerc's N Pipeline project. Christine is a Vancouver poet, and she asked herself one day, how could poetry contribute to getting people involved in resisting the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipelines? The Northern Gateway pipelines, if built, it's still a proposal and a very embattled one with a great deal of resistance. If built, the pipelines would be 1,170 kilometers long, and they would carry the crude oil from the Alberta tar sands to the port of Kitimat in northern British Columbia, where it would from there be pumped into supertankers for export to Asia and the US, and the supertankers would wend their way through many, many miles of the pristine Great Bear Rainforest before reaching the Pacific Ocean. So all in all, not a good thing, in fact a recipe for disaster. Christine's original idea was to gather enough ecological anti-pipeline poems from poets everywhere to construct a poetry pipeline that would itself be 1,170 kilometers long. When each line of each poem was laid down end to end, creating this long ribbon of poetry. So many submissions poured in when she put out the call that before she was done, the N pipeline had grown in length to more than 70,000 kilometers of poetry. That's 43,000 miles of pipeline resistance poetry.
What font was she using?
Yeah, well, a tiny font. We're not talking a big font. It was a tiny font, a ribbon of poetry.
Did she actually lay it?
She laid it somewhere. It was constructed, it was physically constructed. I don't believe it went from the Alberta, was ever strung from the Alberta tar sands to Kitimat, but it was physically constructed and 43,000 miles of pipeline resistance poetry. Now the end pipeline poems, and she began working with a collective on this, coined the term end pipe, the Enbridge pipeline, end pipe, which they defined as meaning to cram a pipe full, to block it, to stuff it so full of something you block it. So the end pipeline of poetry. Now these end pipeline poems, they caught the attention of a publisher, obviously, who said, well, let's put that all together in a book. So it's now also been published as an anthology of the same name, the End Pipeline Poems. I believe that's the title. And the book launch was held on the sidewalk in front of the Enbridge office in Vancouver. Yeah, right, and of course there was media coverage for that as well. So what interests me about each of these poetry geoactivism projects is that they aren't simply cases of a single individual writing poetry to address a problem, using poetry in their own personal work to address a problem. Most of us who are poets are at some point or another engaged in that activity. So these two examples are different because they each use poetry to engage and mobilize large numbers of people into a resistance movement, and that triggered attention and media coverage of the issue in the first place, as well as the unique creative way of addressing it. And in the process of doing all of this, each of these projects effectively changed the terms of the debate, and in the case of the Hanshan project, actually changed the outcome of the debate. So really, to me, this is central to the heart of this is central to activism. The question being, how do you motivate individuals to come together and act for change, to act in defense of the planet? Well, it would appear you give them something interesting to do. You give them the opportunity to be part of something creative and visionary and inspirational, something that is larger than themselves. So I will now turn this over to our three panelists to see what each of them have to say on the topic of geoactivism, and at the end we're going to still have some time for questions and discussion. Our first panelist will be Eric DePlace from Seattle. Eric is the Policy Institute, very sorry, Eric.
It's all right.
Eric is the Policy Director for the Sightline Institute. He is a researcher, writer, speaker, and policy analyst. He spearheads Sightline's work on climate and energy policy. He's known as a leading Northwest expert on strategies to cut carbon pollution, producing widely influential analyses of cap-and-trade programs and carbon taxes. He writes extensively about coal and oil exports, and he's considered an authority on a range of issues connected to fossil fuel transport, including carbon emissions, railway congestion, coal dust, water pollution, and economics. Before coming to Sightline, he worked with the Northwest Area Foundation, developing strategies to alleviate poverty in rural communities. So, Eric, we will be hearing from you on something.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Kim. Although I should, I'm a little bit sorry that you mentioned the Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline, because it's a little experiment I like to do with audiences before we start, particularly American audiences. I like to ask them if they've heard of the Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline. So for those of you who are Americans and who prior to the introduction have heard of the Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline, could you raise your hand? Okay, this is a very informed room. That's a very informed room. Mostly, it turns out to be the case that folks in the U.S. have not heard about the Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline proposal. And in north of the border, that's absolutely not true. Everybody has heard about it, and in fact, everybody hears about it probably every day. That's by way of preface, I think, to the conversation I want to have over the next few minutes. But I'll back up a second and do a little bit of an introduction to mention Sightline Institute. For those of you who don't know us, we're a think tank. We're based here in Seattle. We have sort of a bioregional founding. We were created about 21 years ago, to address sustainability questions in the Pacific Northwest, construed as the territory basically defined by the watersheds of those rivers that carry salmon. That turns out to be British Columbia, Oregon, Washington, plus a few adjoining areas. But I think it's not a terrible working definition of Cascadia, and in fact it's represented almost exactly on that map over there. It's very, very similar to the definition that we use. So let's do just a little more audience participation. How many Canadians do we have in the room? Wow, good going. And how many folks from Oregon? Awesome. Okay, great. So the case I'm going to make today, in the next few minutes, is that geoactivism turns out to be a very, very timely topic for us here in Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. And it might not necessarily be the case that I think that geoactivism would be so significant as a concept in other places. And the reason for that is that this particular region, this Cascadia region, has largely, in the kind of sometimes fuzzy and sometimes precise ways that we define it, largely grounded itself in an identity based on the environment, based on the natural world that we inhabit. And it is also true that this region has been at the forefront politically and socially of the environmental movement for a long, long time. It is not an accident that Greenpeace took its origins from here, and that Oregon, Washington, British Columbia have time after time, and I can enumerate in other talks a whole list of examples of policies that arrived first here or really fleshed out here. That is kind of a fascinating historical curiosity, because this little quiet corner of North America that has prided itself on environmental sort of consciousness and on forward thinking about sustainability issues now finds itself at the crosshairs of an environmental question that, in my judgment, is certainly globally significant and is very arguably among the top environmental questions in the entire world. And the way that I like to talk about this is with a concept called the thin green line. And I'm actually going to pass around some handouts because they help sort of illustrate what this concept is all about. So would you mind? Oh, thanks, Paul. So let's do one more show of hands. Who here has heard of the Keystone XL pipeline? Okay, right. Everyone's heard of the Keystone, right? And it's taken as the signature sort of environmental question of our time in North America. It's sort of held up as a litmus test for President Obama about whether or not he will do the right thing or the wrong thing. And even James Hansen, who's a leading climate scientist, has said something to the effect that if we approve the Keystone XL pipeline and bring those tar sands south to the Gulf Coast, which is where we go down to Gulf Coast refineries, that would be game over for the climate. Now, it turns out that Keystone is incredibly significant. It really is that big a deal. It really will build 830,000 roughly barrels per day of capacity that would move the nastiest oil on Earth into major refining markets and into export markets. It is also true that if you consider this region here, Cascadia, and you think about the major fossil fuel projects that we have on the table right now, coal, oil, and natural gas, added up all the carbon in them, and I'll talk about them very, very briefly in a second, we have the equivalent of 5 Keystone XL pipelines in this region alone right now. And that is simply doing the algebra on the amount of carbon embedded in those fuels. We have, those of you who are in, here's another question for folks in the audience. If you're a Canadian, and you've heard of amber energy, can you raise your hand? So this turns out to be sort of the flip side, where Americans have generally not heard of the Northern Gateway pipeline. There's a very, very rampant coal export debate. Folks in Oregon have probably heard a lot about amber energy. We had 6 coal export proposals in Oregon and Washington. We have 2 oil pipeline proposals in British Columbia. We have now 11 oil by rail, oil train proposals in Oregon and Washington. We have 5 natural gas line proposals. All of these are the real serious ones, the ones that are at some stage of actively seeking permitting or actively looking to build soon, not the more speculative ones. Those are the projects that I'm talking about. 2 oil pipelines, 11 oil train proposals, a couple of which are actually operating right now already. We had 6, now 3 coal export proposals, expansion proposals in BC. All of this grounded in a fundamental geophysical reality, which is that in the interior of North America, we have huge fossil fuel deposits. The Athabascan tar sands, Powder River Basin coal in Wyoming and Montana, shale oil that can be extracted by fracking in North Dakota. All of these fossil fuel deposits are for various reasons hard to move to market. They don't have a natural market in North America. The world's hungriest energy markets are on the far side of the Pacific Ocean. And for economic and logistical reasons, they have to be moved in roughly something like a straight line, which means that to get those fossil fuels up out of the ground into markets where they would be burned and where the carbon would be emitted into the climate, they'll have to travel through the Pacific Northwest. And so that's basically the concept of the thin green line that I like to talk about, is in order for this stuff to have a market, in order for it to really, in some sense, to get dug up and used at all, it will have to pass through, it will need a permission from Oregon, Washington, or British Columbia, from Cascadia. And so we find ourselves in this extremely curious spot where this green sliver of North America that has long prided itself on environmental consciousness is just about, in the next year or two, will decide whether or not it will become a carbon export hub of global significance, or whether it will say no and stop these projects, thereby keeping in the ground some of the largest and nastiest fossil fuel deposits anywhere on the planet. If we are successful in stopping them, it's my contention that we should stop them, by the way. Thank you, Paul. Yeah, I do talk to audiences, but that's not a foregone conclusion. So the upshot of this basically is that we have this region of maybe 16 million people along the North Shore of the Pacific that is in an absolutely unprecedented space historically, a space that we never thought for ourselves, that we'd have for ourselves. And it's worth noting too that there are very few places anywhere in the world that would be more difficult for the fossil fuel industry to enact these proposals. I just got back from a trip to the Gulf Coast, and I spent a bunch of time in southern Louisiana. The Gulf Coast is a place where the fossil fuel industry is well established, where they have a stranglehold on local communities, where they have a stranglehold on politics. That's the kind of place where they operate very effectively. And I think it's fair to say that we don't want that kind of politics, we don't want that kind of culture here in the Pacific Northwest. Here, we have some fossil fuel industry in place. There's coal mining in British Columbia, there are oil refineries in Washington, but it's not deeply rooted, it's not part of our identity, it's not really a major part of our economy. And so this region turns out to be the least likely place on Earth that those coal, oil, and gas companies would have to basically go to battle with to push these proposals forward. And the really weird thing about that is, even though we're small, even though we're sort of out here isolated away from the major centers of power and finance, the weirdest thing that started to happen is that we're starting to win on some of these proposals. And we give a very nice example of the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline. When that project was first announced, everybody thought it was going to be a walkover, and folks thought that they were going to build that. It's actually two pipelines, one moving product east and one moving it back west. There's another gigantic proposal in southern British Columbia now that everyone is talking about in the same way that people were talking about Enbridge a few years ago. It's basically saying, we're going to just push this stuff through, there's nothing you can do about it. The oil wants to get to market, we'll just find some way to move it if you don't build it. Get out of the way, hippies. And what's happened, I've used that sort of facetiously, but that's the way this guy's talking. I'll give you some examples in a second if you want, but what happened is a few years down the road, because of geoactivism, I think you give a very nice example of that, and of robust opposition from First Nations in British Columbia, robust opposition from the environmental community and others, that pipeline is very much on the ropes right now, and I think most odds makers now would say Enbridge is not going to get built, which is huge. It's an enormous win, and it's an enormous win that happened almost out of view of everybody south of the 49th parallel. Which is bizarre, because my contention is that this stuff really should be erasing that boundary. We're looking at Canadian oil going to US markets, US coal going out of Canadian ports, this whole complicated mess. We've had the same story with coal exports. When those of you in Oregon and Washington have probably heard more about coal exports than you care to, I would assume. When those projects first arrived, I sat down with a couple of the project's proponents, me and some other folks, and they were as arrogant as you can imagine. They said, you know you're going to lose. We're going to roll this right over you. But why don't we make it easy on you? I know it's going to be hard. You want to save face. What would you like? What can we give you that would make this go away? They tried to actually buy the Lummi tribe up by Bellingham a totem pole to make them get out of the way. It's a true story. They tried to, well, sure, we're going to build it on your burial grounds, but we could get you a totem pole. That's the kind of attitude they have, right? So let's if you flash forward to a conference that the coal industry had in Billings earlier this spring, those same folks who I sat down across the table with that year were quoted as saying, we're being outgunned in the Northwest. We can't get our projects built. We need help from the rest of the coal industry. We need help from taxpayers in Wyoming and Montana. We're going to lose this stuff, which is huge. Those proposals added up to more carbon emissions than one of those coal terminals alone would add more carbon emissions than the entire state of Washington. So when we've gone from 6 down to 3, and now those last 3 are on the ropes, and even the coal guys know it, we're on the cusp of doing something huge in this region. Something that I think will be globally significant. If we lose, it's going to have global consequences. If we win, we're setting a precedent that we can beat coal, oil, and gas in a way that nobody else has really been able to do. I'll stop there. But thank you.
That was very inspiring. We're making progress. Next up, our next presenter will be Kaia Sand. Kaia is the author of 4 books. She's from Portland, Oregon. She's also dislodged poetry from the book into more unconventional contexts, including Remember to Wave poetry walks and the Happy Valley Project, an investigation of housing foreclosures and financial speculation that included a magic show. So, okay, that's what we're talking about, in terms of some imagination. In collaboration with artist Garrick Imatani, she is the artist in residence at the City of Portland Archives and Records Center, which is a public art project awarded by the Regional Arts and Culture Council. Their collaboration is currently part of the Antenna exhibition at the Blaffer Art Museum in Houston. Kaia is poet in residence in the Portland State University Honors Program. She's a member of PEN American Center and represented on the British Archive of Now. Kaia Sand.
Incredibly inspiring, Eric's talk, and I just love how you synthesize so much, and it really got me thinking about how, I guess it's similar to in a way when I was thinking a lot about how to bring art and imagination to talking about finance. I felt like I'm always 10 steps behind, more than that, when thinking about finance. But how to keep trying, right? How to use a kind of rigorous imagination to address things that just keep multiplying and becoming more complex. And I'm so struck by that when Eric's talking, because it's, we have to map pipeline after pipeline. We have to be so vigilant. He's talking about, well, if you're in Canada, you're hearing this. If you're in Oregon, you're hearing this. So I'd like to just propose that at the end of my little talk, I'm just going to put it back out for us to be thinking about, is how to use that imagination for the very things that Eric's talking about, for what Stephen Hollis was talking about with the kind of, the narrow pathways, right, of the trains and the pipelines. So, with that, I just was thinking about, geoactivism, and how, for me, as a poet, how I approach this. And basically, my preoccupations, as all of our preoccupations, enters into my work. And so I had preoccupations around distribution of power and unequal distributions of power. And so that sort of shot through generally what I'm doing. And I put up this quote by Charles Olson that's an epigraph in my first book, because I feel like when I think about activism, that kind of is what it is for me. It's just, we all have these contours of a little life. So while we're alive, how do we try, right? So in terms of just a few different examples. Oh, actually, I wanted to say though, one premise of when I'm thinking about this, sometimes I'm making work that's really in the service of poetry, or that's in the service perhaps sometimes the service of activism, but I guess I just really think about that kind of creativity and these poetic gestures that we're capable of as translatable. And so this was a band, Stereolab. Jules Boykoff and I had, for 1 year, a Poetry and Politics radio show in Walla Walla, Washington. And this is how we began our show, this Stereolab song. And I just loved it. Led to all the creativity we must find. And that's, I think, sums up in a way the way in which these things are translatable. So sometimes maybe it is just that poem on the page, but how is that thinking translatable in other ways? So when I think about how geography informs my work, this is a very gritty image, but I love what the image is, so I've still put it up there. It's over a decade ago in the Tripwire journal that David Buch and Yetta Morrison were putting out. I came across this essay by Heriberto Yepes, and he wrote about his sign project he did on the border of Tijuana and San Diego. And it really just shifted things in my brain where I started thinking about how geography itself can be a context for the poem, that I was taking for granted that it needed to be inside a book. So just to be thinking about then the way in which place itself, infuses significance. So this is on the turnstiles actually of the border, and that little gritty sign says they told us we were crossing the border to prevent us from really doing it. And a lot of the signs are also in Spanish, they shift around. So that was, a very important kind of cognitive shift for me. And one of the things that I think about, then in terms of geography in the work that I do is a connective thinking. The elsewhere and the erstwhile is how I put it. The ways in which we can shift around. We have that physical anchor, the embodiment, right, that takes place when we're in place. But then, and that's always evocative. But then we can make these very large shifts. So just really briefly, after the Yepes, Jules Boykoff and I started documenting public poetry projects. Like Pipa in New York after 9/11, they plastered poems around the city. In Kaneohe, Hawaii, Susan Schultz puts up these signs. She's the sidewalk blogger. Pache, a Philadelphia-based public poetry project, or a private space in some ways, because they're interested in using commercial spaces as context. And so we engaged in this. At the time, we were in Southern Maryland, and so we were also interested in how place itself then lends conventions. So this sign that we put up, the America Who Owns the Wealth, is borrowing from the plywood signs that were common to the region, right? So the geography, the cultural geography, right, informs that. And then this was another sign that we put up that, again, in terms of the elsewhere and the erstwhile, we were right next to a military base, and this was right before the U.S. military went into Iraq in March of 2003. So, it was a really potent time of hoping that invasion could be stopped. And so there were the ways in which there's the connective thinking with that. Just really quickly, because I always feel like when I think about this topic, I always go back to Lucille Clifton. I got to work with her during over a decade ago in Maryland, and she's a poet, or a late poet and children's writer, and she always was sort of doing these kind of provocations, right, of how do you use your imagination to see the political history of where you are? And what I feel like for me, that's kind of an open question that I just carry with me all the time, just as a very specific example, because this always comes out in her work too, but we went on a field trip in Southern Maryland, and she asked me to look for the graves of the enslaved people in the cemetery where we were standing. And when I said, well, I don't know, she said, yes, but they're there, so how do you see them? Because the markers are gone, right? The rocks are in the walls or disintegrated. So that's what I carry with me. And Stephen Collis so generously brought up the Remember to Wave project, and that's what really informed that project, is that, I could walk, this is a map I made, but let me see if I can just, oops. But basically, it's just walking through this space in North Portland around the Expo Center. And snap. I always hate though showing the trappings of the software, right?
Yeah.
I feel like such an advertiser. But this just kind of can give you a little sense of moving through this space. And one of the things I was really interested in is that provocation that Lucille gave me of how do you read the political history of the space when it's really hard to see. So with, as Stephen was mentioning earlier, like the forced incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II is actually in that building we just walked by that's now used for trade shows. And so one of the things I became really interested in this with that elsewhere erstwhile thinking is looking for situational rhymes, and I want to tie that back to thinking about what we do with the trains and the pipelines now. Is I looked around and I thought, what kind of connections can I make? So right here, it's going to move next to these portable on-demand storage units. And I started thinking about these as kind of like monuments to possession in a space where people were told they could only bring what they could carry when they were incarcerated, right? And so, how is it then that I just coax that out? And that's what a poetic imagination can lend to things, is these sort of wild swerves. So that's Remember to Wave. And just briefly, thinking about then the ways in which one thing moves to the next. That project led to working with the Organique Legacy Center. And I was working with this center to make connections between then the forced incarceration of Japanese Americans in our area and the former Nihon Machi, or Japantown, where they were forcibly evacuated, to what is now a neighborhood where there's a lot of people who are homeless. So one of the things we did is these workshops that just brought people together, so workshops of people who were homeless, but learning about that history. So not thinking about it's not a workshop about homelessness. And it became a really interesting, powerful experience. And one of the poets I met through that, Leo Rhodes, here he is. He wrote a poem, it's very small, but he wrote a poem that was responding to the poet Lasani Nada's poem that's looking at Gila River Reservation and how there was internment on that. Well, Leo had grown up the Gila River Reservation. He wrote a poem in response. And then Lawson and he started kind of going on the road, that they were showing these connections, again, all these elsewhere erstwhile connections. And I was thinking about all this with Leo, because being up here in Seattle, he helped start Tent City, and he's this amazing political activist, and he's now a part in Portland of Right to Dream 2, which is a kind of liberatory housing space where people who are homeless have taken over this block. It's a whole complex story, but there's a lot of creativity in it, including painted doors that are used as walls, and Leo's writing a play, and so there's always that shift again, right? Finding all the creativity is between poetry, art, activism, and so let's just go back to this. Just really quickly, another way that I've been thinking about it is just in terms of activism, then having creative forms that I want to celebrate, so that these little things that people do, how do they add up? And how do we just honor them? So one of the things has just been, I've been looking at protest maps as forms, and kind of ritualistically honoring them. So this map, there's a bunch of maps layered here, but one of them is of a 1978 Women's Night March in Portland that was an early sort of Take Back the Night march, demanding that violence against women be addressed. And I've started doing poetry around that includes walking the march, but in a 3-foot by 3-foot space, so it becomes a kind of contorted, movement. And I just wanted to end then on some images, because this is sort of putting it back out there, again, with thinking of Eric saying that about Steve earlier, is that, so there's all these trains and pipelines, so a situational rhyming, right? How do we do something that keeps sort of connecting it up for people? So this is actually a different train through the Northwest. This is the white train that carried nuclear munitions from Amarillo, Texas to Bangor, Washington. And really similar to the oil trains going through Oregon now, it was really hard to find out when they were going through. And I read about one man who lived in Bangor, Washington, who just moved there at the end of the line so he could be a train spotter for activists. I mean, really amazing. And now, I mean, there's a lot about our local media that's really sad in Oregon, but one positive thing is there's a journalist, Rob Davis, who's writing for the Oregonian, who's just doggedly tracking the oil trains. And he's sort of bringing a lot to the surface right now about, you know, when they're coming through. So the White Trains activists put their bodies on the train tracks to try to stop it and bring attention also to the fact that these trains are going through the Northwest. Oh, this is a mega load, right? Going up to, bringing supplies up to the tar sands, and of course all this activism trying to stop these. And those are so interesting. It's kind of these monstrous vehicles that are sort of part train, part, I don't know, brontosaurus. And then this is one of the oil trains, and a guy that he was taking pictures of flowers or birds or something, and he accidentally got this picture, and then Rob Davis, the Oregonian reporter, published it. It said, here's one of the oil trains. So I put these images up there just to situationally rhyme with something. What do we do, right? How do we make connections that help gather the million pipeline train, you know, all the complexity of it, and articulate it in an evocative, provocative way. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Kaia. Our final panelist is Trevor Carolan from North Vancouver. Trevor teaches at University of Fraser Valley. He is the co-editor of the newly published eco-lit anthology, Cascadia, The Life and Breath of the World, published by University of Hawaii Press. And Trevor has copies of that here with him if anybody's interested in that. A former elected municipal councillor in the District of North Vancouver, Trevor has worked as a media advocate on behalf of Pacific Coast watershed issues and First Nation land claims. As a councillor, he's worked to preserve the North Shore's cove and mountain forests in Seymour from logging and massive real estate development. He was instrumental in shepherding the Varley Trail at Lynn Canyon headwaters and the Lower Seymour Conservation Area into being. And his civic affairs column, Poetic License, appears in North Shore News. Thank you very much, Trevor.
Thank you. Thanks again. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the ancestral people. Stephen from SFU offered thanks earlier too. That's the tradition where we come from around here. That's the local Procerish dialect that we speak near where I live, in South Maryland. And it's great to be here in the 12-man city. Up in Vancouver, we used to hear about Seattle as the Emerald City, and it never really seemed to catch on, but somehow the 12-man city really has come on. So I kind of feel sort of like an honorary Seahawk being here today. I just really want to say thanks to that. But the other thing is, you know, how the devil can we all be sitting on here talking about Cascadia and making things right and making it better and put up these unspeakably horrid traffic jams in every conceivable direction in this city. There's so much talent and so much smarts here. Bill Gates and Paul Allen and the Seahawks management, and stadiums down on the waterfront that are big enough to put half, like half the West Coast in. But these jams have been going on for 10 years every direction. Can anybody do anything about that down here?
Get out of their cars.
There you go.
Bicycle.
Okay, well, after that, thank you all again, and just thank you to all the volunteers. And I guess it's good to be mindful of where we are. We're at this beautiful Jesuit campus, so really thanks to the Catholic community for opening up here. That's a really nice sign of interfaith gathering too, something I guess that we can all acknowledge as well. It's really nice to see them willing to jam with poets and writers. That's cool. So thank you to this fine university, Pax Vobiscum. Just as a disclosure, I don't claim any special pedagogical ability in the area of environmental studies, but having worked on numbers of campaigns and on different projects through the years, I've got some knowledge in certain areas. So what I'm able to do here today is really to share the good ideas of other people who I've been working with, and some of whom are in this book, this new one that's come out, Cascadia, to wider public attention. So these aren't all my ideas. I'm sharing what's come to me from other people in that spirit of working together. Among my own curiosities, though, is the condition of our biosphere, what Buddhists might recognize as an instance that relates to our common ecological situation. The kinds of neighbors and writers that I like hanging with and spending time with find this a cause for concern and often for engaging in different forms of action. So just to get that part out of the way, I take it as a given among people in a room like this that Geoactivism incorporates attending municipal and regional planning committee meetings, community association and socially engaged organization meetings, public protests, marches and manifestations, writing letters to newspapers and politicians and phoning politicians' constituent offices, making signs, getting out to vote, organizing community and political and social issue campaigns, maybe cleaning up a local area where we have an attachment to, and gathering information for all of those initiatives. Standing in front of a bulldozer, enduring overt and covert police and intelligence agency surveillance while covering a story or participating in an action, getting arrested climbing over oil refinery towers to hang Greenpeace banners, getting threatened, getting roughed up, being badly beaten by angry backwoods activists from the other side are potentially optional. Pushing a button for a computer petition does not count. Talking at parties about being an activist while currently fashionable does not count. There are, however, as Frank Stewart from U of Hawaii, my co-editor on this Cascadia edition, as he notes, there are many kinds of activism, and one of the most powerful kinds is activism of the ethical imagination. Toward that, this concept then that we're talking about this weekend of Cascadia is not a self-absorbed literary or academic regionalism. British Columbia, where I come from, in Deep Cove, and the U.S. Pacific Northwest is a prime example of a geographic area from which to address environmentalism. And I felt so honored today to get a chance to work with Eric LaPlace here from Sightlines Institute, because we all look to Seattle for that kind of policy announcement, that kind of policy direction and initiative. I've seen them cited in some of those really terrific PBS documentaries that you've done down here out of Seattle, KCTS, on the coal train issues. And I wrote in a column, why the hell can't we do that up in British Columbia, where we've got enormous pressing issues? We can't seem to get that out. But we do have a couple of crews working here today who are beginning to address that subject. So Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, Oregon, Washington, BC, and some of the outlying or the adjacent areas have unique attributes, a diverse multicultural mix of people, particular economic strengths, and some innovative approaches to civic planning and to public services. Vancouver has a civic mandate under the current administration of being the greenest city in the world. Seattle has a mandate of continuing to foster the most innovative, progressive, greenest economy in North America. And Portland, it's worth noting, is still the city that people look to from around North America for enlightened thinking about transportation issues and housing expansion issues. And I can be corrected on this, but I have been down there, and I've talked with Gary Snyder's son who works there, that you've got this idea of concentric rings around the city. And there is actually a graduated system in place for development that can serve as guidelines, to enlightened guidelines regarding civic development. We have nothing like that north of the border. Cascadian Eco-Lit, then, is a way that we share a common regard for securing a future for ourselves and our planet. And as writers, what can we do? We've heard some good ideas, but one of the things I think that poets particularly have to offer is this understanding that intimacy itself brings understanding. Because we know our region intimately, we see how easily it is violated. We know what can be lost. Cascadian lit then, and I'm making a distinction here between a particular type of eco-lit versus writing that just happens to be produced in the Cascadia region. There's two different animals swimming here or working here. Cascadian eco-lit typically isn't about details of awards or personal victory or defeat, nor about the shallower gestures of environmentalism. It frequently evokes memories and feeling from our deep, personal, direct experience with the natural world. It reflects our own historic period in adapting to what Rex Weiler, one of the co-founders of Greenpeace International, notes is a global biosphere that is in remedial crisis. In his essay in the book that he kindly let us use, Reinhabitation, Gary Snyder, who used to live and work not far from here, born just down the road, lived and worked up Highway 20 if you drive north, hang out right on Highway 20, go through Marble Mount, get into Ross Lake, Diablo Lake. That's the beat where these fellows were working as forest rangers when they were young. Still a fabulous place to visit. And, of course, an unsolicited plug for the North Cascades Institute every August, and I think Mr. Nelson's done it. They do sponsor an opportunity to walk with some guides. It's a couple of days overnight hike to go up across the lake and up Desolation Peak, where Gary and Kerouac and Phil Whale and different people spent time working in deep meditation disguised as forest rangers or forestry lookouts, park rangers. So it can still be done. You can follow in those tracks if you want. It's not expensive. I think Paul, you can talk to Paul later on about how rugged it is. You're not going to do this in your flip-flops. Anyway, Snyder says that communities in Cascadia think in a way that transcends political boundaries and that is unified by their experience with and their knowledge of local flora and fauna, and the water, air, mineral, and nutrient cycles that are shared within this bioregion. Experiencing the intensity and the power of the wilderness inevitably leads to consciousness of the devastation of old-growth forests. Someone like Judith Roche, the poet, could tell us of salmon breeding grounds, of pristine lakes, and other icons of this region. So it was no accident, as Scott mentioned earlier, that Greenpeace was founded in Vancouver, here in the Cascadia region. Now, part of our role is to witness how the wild is also our true home, to kind of paraphrase a line from Thich Nhat Hanh. The bioregion that connects us to each other. It's also a place where we observe how our local cultures react to this bioregion. That's the larger culture. This place that we inhabit is still rich in its legacy of cultural traditions, of ceremonies that are still tied to the land and sea, just like places out on the prairies, like places in old Europe where we go on our backpacking journeys. If we think about it, we've got community bonfires, pole raisings, powwows, rodeos, potlatches, agricultural fairs, canoe races. The insignia of our school and our sports teams are frequently totems drawn from nature. The lions, cougars, huskies, orcas, salmon bellies, grizzlies, bears, eagles, seahawks, thunderbirds. This is who the heck we are. Snyder goes on to ask, how does knowledge of place help us to know the self? So if we're going to talk about some kind of activism, before we're going to get larger, first we need to know ourselves. Fundamentally, the answer, again, to borrow from Thich Nhat Hanh, is that we're all composite beings. We're drawn from all the things that make us, all the non-self elements that go into making up what we call Kaia, or Eric, or Paul, or Kim. Physically, intellectually, we come from this place. And there are different ways of understanding what that means. Eric mentioned that there were conversations with coal industry people. Sometimes we feel we're talking a different language. Really what we're looking at is a different way of thinking. It's a different way of walking down the same stretch of pavement. Sometimes, I learned in politics, that's what we have to do. We sometimes have to make an effort to try and look how they're seeing us. And sometimes that can be an opening for some commonalities. There are different ways of understanding what place and ownership means. In English, to speak English, we can own the land. Among traditional First Nations peoples, the meaning changes. And I'll just shift because I'm not First Nations, but I am Irish by heritage, and in the Irish Gaelic, we can't say my land. The language doesn't work that way because Irish contains no possessive pronouns. What you say in Gaelic is that the land is me. The meaning has changed entirely. So in Irish, you embody the land. And my Aboriginal neighbors up the road, who yesterday at 10 o'clock, there was an announcement while we were driving down here, have announced that they have now instituted the first major legal challenge against the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And regrettably, that's going to cost them a lot of money. A lot of white folks out there are happy because the pipelines get challenged, but they're leaving the dirty work, and not enough people are shouldering the wheel. In a very, very small First Nations community where we live, 450 people, they're doing well, but they're having to put their shoulder to that wheel and start spinning it for the larger community. And we hope that you start picking up some strength in that area. Well, in Irish, you embody the land. The Aboriginal people see it something close the same way in their Hulkamelan language, which happily we teach at the university where I live. The kind of writers and writing that I understand and recognize as being actively Cascadian in nature offer ways to reimagine culture, community, ecology, language, engage citizenship, knowledge, and the life of the spirit. They address the wasteful and destructive practices of the present and propose creating a larger community that will collectively advocate the preservation of this Cascadia region and our planet in all its biocultural depth and breadth. Writers here who only work from home are different from those who write from the wild of the world. And what we need, as our BC poet Robert Ringhurst says, is room in a shared world. He says cultures need places. And in grappling with the issues of how far we have strayed from nature, Cascadian writers continue to address ideas of, and this, we've heard this at different times, last night, today, of mutual aid, of interdependence, of peace, of self-discipline, of bearing lay witness and cross-cultural ideas between Aboriginal, European settler, and Trans-Pacific. That's East Asian spiritual traditions that have come to us. Now, regarding current affairs, some of us are concerned or frustrated with the way that the energy futures debate is being discussed right now. Our former Canadian Prime Minister, the Honourable Joe Clark, wisely said recently in Vancouver that as a people, we have to earn our way going forward. We have to earn our way going forward as a people. And he's right. Cascadia offers a unique capacity for change in the way that we respond to the world. And the first step to do that is making things, in making it better, is to recognize that holding an alternative view to rapacious corporate domination over the natural world does not represent an ideological blindness. It means that the way we use our intelligence is different, like those people in Billings, Montana. In Canada, our country has lost its way a little bit. The benefits of economic development are falling to a relatively small group. However, the risks are calculated to fall on a much wider swath of society. We're not nearly in agreement about what the real benefits of fossil fuel development are, and the debate is increasingly pugilistic on both sides. Now, regarding responsible economic development, most of us are poets in here, but we're all citizens. In Cascadia, we have the legacy of being a resource-based region. Coming down Vancouver Island a couple of days ago, we stopped off at Ladysmith and saw the old copper mining museum. We saw the coal mining museums in all of the small towns. There's lots of interest. There's actually a new airline flying direct from Seattle to Nanaimo, where next year's Cascadia Festival will be held. I'm not sure that's all about the tourism industry. We hope it is. We hope it's about the education industry. But they're also talking about opening up the old coal deposits just north of Nanaimo for the export trade, for the metallurgical coal, to go over to China, to Korea, to Japan. More alarm on the horizon. Well, it's not the same economic base, though, this natural resource development, that for a long time it was in Cascadia. There's now a huge technology push going on. You probably saw the Seattle Times, the Seattle paper yesterday. On the front page, there was a note that Microsoft is starting a new expanded operation in Vancouver with 400 positions going up there, $90 million a year into Vancouver. Good for Vancouver. There's nothing surprising in that, because now, in fact, there are more people at work in the high-tech, infotech area of the economy in the Vancouver region, what we call the Lower Mainland. That would be the Fraser River watershed. Than in all the natural resource development industries in British Columbia combined. There's been an enormous seismic shift that's happened in the nature of our economy. But what's getting the headlines? What's getting the discussion? We face a tsunami of paid propaganda, of think tanks, of media advocates for large corporate interests, continually in the paper, in the form of what are essentially unpaid op-ed. That's unpaid opinion editorial essays in the newspaper. And we, of course, mom and pop get those papers, those who still read them, and if they've read it in the newspaper, it must be true, right? Who's paying for that? All right. Well, if we take the notion or the emotion out of the economic debate and look at all our sectors of what contributes to quality of life here, if we consider which ones foster our spirit of economic innovation as well as jobs and wealth, we find that the dominating noise isn't really domestically focused. All that noise increasingly is being directed toward an export strategy that Eric mentioned. So, who benefits? What are the risks? We're not focusing on the whole strategy. That's the idea of social license that was mentioned. Corporations sell themselves, and to gain credibility with the public, there's this idea of giving back, maybe a totem pole. Sometimes it's more sophisticated, and it's a good thing. But big energy corporations, in particular in the Northwest here, tell us that their proposed operations will be a tax bonanza for the public. This is what we hear over and over. But let's unpack that a little bit. Polling tells us that there continues to be heavy public opposition to the pipelines and to the coal train proposals. People don't like what they see. And what we should remember is that the first principle of sustainability is the right to say no when it doesn't make sense. Greenpeace, again, was born in Vancouver around 1970, just down the road from where we live, by a couple of old pals of ours. My old hero, Bob Hunter, who was also a newspaper columnist, and I inherited his after Doug Collins, actually, a more right-wing columnist. So it's got a quirky history, this column in the newspaper where I work. It developed in a very anarchic, organic fashion when, as Hunter says, quote, a handful of Canadian activists founded a handful. We're talking about 8 or 10 people here. Christian activists, Quakers, silent meditators, hippies. When a handful of Canadian activists founded an organization devoted to improving ecological conditions and denouncing nuclear weaponry. A group of friends and allies sailed to help stop nuclear testing, US nuclear testing, in the Amchitka region of Alaska. And in protest, they sailed up the coast in an old fish boat, and they changed the way that we now live in the world. That's a small group of people. Isn't everybody an environmentalist nowadays? Even a little bit. That's what one small group can do. So it doesn't go to work. Sometimes, a poem might not be the only way, but it can be a contribution. We just need to get together with 7 or 8 or 9 other people, and suddenly we've got something else happening. A little before that, again, we have to remember that in the 50s, Gary Snyder and some of his friends who came from Depression-era economies were working in this region here and began producing the formative works of a regional eco-literature that became enormously influential. Jack Kerouac wrote a book called The Dharma Bums, and look what happened. Suddenly, it's cool to be that way. I think we need to make it cool again to be engaged. At the moment, it's nice to talk about at parties, but young people on campuses, let's face it right now, are not being encouraged to get out and get active. There is a big dumbing down campaign that is actively promoted by big industry to make it uncool to be hip. Students these days are expected to be concerned, but not to get out there and do something about it. They're being pressured not to do that. They're being seduced not to do that with movies, with television programs. And I think we used to see Maynard G. Krebs on the Dobie Gillis show when some of us were kids back in the Napoleonic age. He was the oddball, the beatnik guy. But these days, being the engaged student, there's a diminishment of that coolness factor about getting out there and doing something. And it's difficult to overcome that when they look at the seduction of constant distraction with a lot of the cell phones and little bits of technology people have got with them, probably even in this room. Well, sometimes eco-minded folks get asked blunt questions like, okay, so what's the solution? What political leaders mean is give us solutions that will allow us to keep running our stuff the same way and not have to change too much. That's the wrong idea. The Japanese poet Nanao Sakaki used to warn that we outsmart ourselves with solutions that trap us within destructive habits. Political leaders love solutions that feature high technology. Solar panels, windmills, ethanol, nuclear fuels, green products, clean coal, whatever that is. These ideas appeal to our longing for a solution we can control and from which someone could profit. But all technological systems have hidden costs and limited lifespans. The only surefire method that doesn't cost much is conservation. So there isn't always a ready answer or a silver bullet. These days I'm getting more interested in something that Northrop Frye, Margaret Apatow, professor at U of Toronto, said, and that was, he said, it's not always about knowing what the answers are. He says, sometimes the hardest thing to do is to find out the simplest questions that produce the hardest answers. I think that's where we're getting at. It's difficult, just before I wrap up here, not to feel voiceless sometimes. Many of us are still from a generation that worked to build an inclusive political and educational model that provided us with a legitimate voice in the decision-making process. It's getting harder to know exactly who's calling the shots anymore, to know clearly who's in the decision-making kitchen of what they're cooking up. But we can keep on writing, we can share what we know of this place, why we love, and why we care for it. Now, as this book opens up here, languages and literatures, primarily poetry, song narrative, whether oral or written, bring us close to the truth of a place, and they help us experience this biocultural region called Cascadia. What can we do? If it's eco-poetics, let's get a clearer idea of the terrain. As Kim Goldberg notes, this kind of writing, quote, is not so much nature-minded as ecologically sensitive, meaning that its aesthetics are socially, politically, and spiritually grounded. So, one step at a time. As the theologian Father Richard Newhouse advocates, we change a culture by creating a community. And that's what this Cascadia Poetry Festival is doing, and will do again next year. It's creating a meeting point where local community, artistic, academic, and perhaps in the future even business and governance interests can begin working together on key cultural and ecological issues. So from a biocentric point, what's to lose? As the poet Michael McClure writes, listen, the whales are singing very clearly in our hearts. Thank you.
Big thank you to all of our three panelists, Eric DePlace, Kaia Sand, Trevor, Carolan, talking about geoactivism. How are we time-wise? Do we have any time for discussion? Okay, 2 questions and then we're out of here. Yes, in the back.
Question for Eric. Pipelines, this is about jurisdiction and being able to stop these things going forward. Pipelines go across state boundaries and they have state jurisdiction. So this is one of the reasons they've been stopped. But at least in the United States, this is not true of any kind of railroads. I believe it's national. This is one of the problems we're suffering. What are some of your ideas going forward on how to stop like some of these trains that are coming through?
Yeah, so oil by rail is a phenomenon that's happened recently in many parts of the country. In most places, it's actually very, very hard to stop because.
You want to play?
Yeah, we can just.
Or we could.
Thanks. In most places, it's very, very hard to stop because railroads are federally preempted. They exist in a regulatory vacuum, basically. That's actually not true here because their destination sites are proposed to be here, so they're trying to build 3 in the Grace Harbor region, a gigantic one at the Port of Vancouver on the Columbia, Port of Vancouver, Washington, and at the refineries along Puget Sound. So we actually have a say in whether or not they have destinations. If they don't have a destination, they're not going to run. So that's and we have jurisdiction over the air quality permits and some other permits, even for the sites that are already taking oil trains right now. This is actually why I think it's so important that Cascadia is engaged in a way that other places aren't, because we're the places with the actual port terminals. If we say no to those things, the trains don't run, it doesn't come out of the ground.
Well, how then are we going to work with, the ILWU, which is probably pro?
They're not. The ILWU and the Port of Vancouver, Washington has actually come out against the big proposal there.
Great.
Unlike with coal, we're actually on labor's side. The train and locomotive engineers are very, very concerned because the oil trains keep blowing up, including one earlier this week. I get more media calls about exploding oil trains than anything else. But the transition point is then to talk about environmental issues. But labor unions are going to be with us, I think, on oil trains.
That's great.
Yeah.
Can I also just add that in British Columbia, the land is unceded. That is, the First Nations never made treaties. They never gave up their claims and rights, for the most part.
Yeah.
So it puts it in a really complicated legalistic space. And they're almost all dead set against these projects. And that's one of our best hopes too for stopping this.
In British Columbia, I think there's a solid wall of resistance from approximately 130 Native nations all along the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline. Every one of those could mount a legal challenge. Every one of those nations could if they wanted.
At the UN if they want.
Any other questions? I just wanted to say that you might have some more questions for the panelists, but the idea of this festival is to have time in between events. So Living Room is an open democratic reading. It doesn't start till 3. So we have some time for that. And then that goes 3 to 5, and between 5 and 7:30, there's time to see somebody. To go up to David McCloskey and say, those are amazing maps. How do I get one? How did you start? To make these connections and deepen these connections from people who came from a long way to be here. So the dialogue just starts, and it happens in the spaces between events as well.
Excellent.
Kim Goldberg, thank you for hosting, and thank you for coming.